Hi, my name is Megan Walsh. I'm a doctoral student in the Special Education Department at Vanderbilt University. And during this brief presentation today, I'm going to be giving an overview of the taxonomy of intervention intensity. I'll be explaining what the taxonomy is and then how it can be used to help meet the needs of students with severe and persistent learning and behavior challenges in the context of database individualization, or DBI. Before we get into the taxonomy, though, I want to back up for a second and talk about the last thing I just said, which was DBI. Simply put, DBI, or database individualization, is a systematic method for using data to determine when and how to provide more intensive intervention for students. This isn't a brand new approach or anything. DBI had its origin in database program modification and experimental teaching, first developed at the University of Minnesota by Stan Dino and Phyllis Merkin in 1977. And what DBI is it's a process. What it's not, and this is very important to note, it's not a single intervention program or strategy. It's not ever a one-time fix, but an ongoing process that practitioners engage in that comprises intervention and assessment and uses data for the purpose of making adjustments over time, also known as individualization. DBI is a process, and in that process comprises two main phases, the setup phase and the implementation phase. In the setup phase, practitioners are going to select a validated, best matched Tier 2 program to serve as the platform for intensive intervention. When I say validated, what I mean is that the intervention has evidence of efficacy with students in need of intervention. Best match means that it is the most clearly aligned with the needs of an individual student. Typically, the students with whom you're using a DBI approach are those who have already failed to respond to a validated Tier 2 intervention. So these are students with severe and persistent, and I emphasize that persistent part, learning challenges. These might be students in Tier 3 or Tier 4, they might be students with disabilities, however your student classifies this. These students are those for whom something more intense than a validated Tier 2 intervention will be necessary. So in the setup phase, we select the best available with the knowledge that adjustments are probably and definitely going to need to be made. Okay, we might even want to make some adjustments at the onset to make the intervention more intensive right from the go. So in that setup phase, we're going to select that best available. And then we're also going to select a validated progress monitoring system. Sometimes a Tier 2 intervention will include a progress monitoring measure, but most of them won't. So we're going to need to identify a progress monitoring tool that's going to be aligned to the student's goals, is sensitive to growth, and has good psychometric qualities. That's what we're going to be doing in the setup phase of the DBI process. Okay, remember, this is a process. It's not a single intensive intervention, so we're not just going to find something. We're identifying something, and from there, we're going to move into the implementation phase. In the implementation phase, we're going to engage in the process of individualization. And that process means that we're slowly intensifying that Tier 2 intervention we identified it in the setup phase in an attempt to get closer and closer to meeting the needs of our students. Okay, the implementation phase is a cyclical process of analyzing data, formulating adjustments based on that data, implementing the adjustments, collecting more data, analyzing the data. You get the picture. We're going to keep going back and forth through these steps. Okay, and on an ongoing basis, we're going to take a very systematic look at the data we're collecting through progress monitoring to determine if the student is making adequate progress. Okay, we're going to ask ourselves, is this student progressing? Are they on track to meet their goal? If the answer to those questions when we check in is yes, we're just going to continue implementing that intervention just the same way we had been for a given number of weeks. And again, we're going to analyze our data, say, okay, is the student now progressing? Are they continuing to be on track to meet their goals? At some point, if the answer to those questions is no, we're going to take a second, we're going to collect additional diagnostic data to help us better understand why that student isn't progressing. And we're going to use that data to formulate an adjustment to the intervention platform that we're using to make it more intense for that student. Okay, then we'll implement that adjusted intervention with that new adjustment in it, and we're going to begin the process of collecting and analyzing that data anew. This cycle is going to continue over and over until the student meets their goal at which point, ostensibly, we're going to return back to the setup phase, actually, and continue the cycle again by selecting a new intervention that meets students with their new needs wherever they are now that they've met their goal, and continue this process of database individualization until we get the students up to where we want them to be. The taxonomy of intervention intensity is a tool to support practitioners in this DBI process. It's a system for describing interventions in terms of the 7 dimensions along which intensity can vary. I kind of like to think of it like a soundboard. Okay, we can run an intervention through the taxonomy and use the dimensions like knobs or sliders to kind of titrate or intensify the intervention at different points to help meet the needs of an individual student. The taxonomy can support the DBI process both in the setup phase and in the implementation phase. In the setup phase, the taxonomy can help practitioners identify the validated Tier 2 platform that they want to use and the best match for an individual student. And then in the implementation phase, they can use the taxonomy to help them formulate smart and targeted adjustments. The taxonomy comprises 7 dimensions. And here's an example of a form that you could use to rate an intervention platform on those 7 dimensions of intervention intensity. We've provided a draft of this form in the handout section of this webinar, so feel free to access that as we talk about this and move through this webinar. Using this form, what you're going to do is ideally, in the setup phase, rate an intervention, or hopefully 7 or more, however many interventions you have, to determine the best match for a student. And you're going to rate it on these 7 dimensions. These are listed on the left side of this form. Those are strength, dosage, alignment, attention to transfer, comprehensiveness, behavioral support, and individualization. I'm going to explain what each of those dimensions are in just a second. But using this rating form, what we would do is we'd rate each of the components that kind of make up those dimensions and give an intervention a score. Usually we use a rating scale of 0 to 3, with 3 meaning there's lots of good evidence that this intervention platform would meet that component. 0 means there's no evidence of that. And ideally what we would do is we would kind of rate each of these components, come up with average scores for each of the dimensions, and then compare several different intervention platform ratings to each other to kind of find the right one for us. During the implementation phase, at each of our designated checkpoints, so maybe we've decided that every 2 weeks we're going to review our progress monitoring data, or every 3 or every 6, depends on kind of what area you're working on and the student and when you'd expect to see changes. But when we look at our data and we get to a point where we say, nope, this student is not progressing, they're not meeting their goals, they're not on track, we would then fill out one column on this right side of the form, and we would analyze that collected progress monitoring data, analyze our diagnostic data, and decide kind of which dimension can we do something to, can we intensify to make this intervention more intense for this student and hopefully get them to progress more quickly. All right, so I hope at this point you're beginning to see how the taxonomy of intervention intensity fits within the DBI framework. During the remainder of this session, I'm going to review those 7 dimensions that I just talked about, along which intensity can vary. The first dimension is strength. And when I say strength, I mean how well this intervention could be expected to work for students in need of intensive intervention. To determine the strength, you're going to want to consider if this intervention produces good results for students who require intensive intervention. And it's important to note here that most interventions, the way research is conducted, are conducted with students at risk. And some of the students at risk are those students in need of intensive intervention, right? Those students who have extremely low scores, who have not responded very well. But students at risk can also include Tier 2 students, or students who are maybe just below the 50th percentile, maybe in that low average range. So most research is going to report effect sizes for students kind of in that whole broad area, anybody below the 50th percentile generally. If you're looking at the strength of an intervention for a student needing intensive intervention, you're wanting to know what are the effects that I can expect for students in the 20th percentile or below, those students who are likely to not respond to a Tier 2 intervention right away. And so typically research isn't going to necessarily report these directly in a funding. Some of them will, but you might have to look a little bit closer, dig a little deeper. I encourage you to use the NCII website, intensiveintervention.org, to use their tools chart. And on their tools chart, they've kind of done some of this digging and groundwork for you to find the disaggregated effect sizes for students below the 20th percentile. When those effect sizes aren't available, whether on the NCII tools chart or in the research reports themselves, you may want to reach out to researchers or intervention developers for more information. And if they have it, they'll probably provide it for you. A note about effect sizes. When I say effect size, an effect size is just a standardized measure that we use to describe how much higher intervention students performed at the end of the intervention when compared with students who didn't get the intervention. And it's usually given in standard deviation units. I know that's a little bit confusing, but it's just kind of a way that we can objectively compare intervention strength to one another. Typically, an intervention that reports an effect size of 0.35 to 0.4 would be considered a moderate effect. So you might give it a score of 2 for strength, right? If they give you an effect size of 0.5 or above, that would be a very strong effect, and it would probably get a score of 3. Scores below 0.35 are typically considered small effects. It's important to note, though, that those are rules of thumb. So in some academic areas, for example, reading comprehension, you're going to kind of expect actually smaller effect sizes, especially if they're talking or using standardized measures. The effect sizes tend to be much smaller. So you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt and recognize that those are just rules of thumb that give us a sense of how strong intervention is. Older students also tend to have smaller effect sizes. So research with older students is going to have smaller effect sizes too. When you're rating the strength of an intervention, the higher the effect size for students at or below the 20th percentile, the more intense that intervention is. Effect sizes are generated from the experimental studies themselves, from the research. So this is one dimension of the taxonomy that won't change. So as I'm intensifying this intervention and I'm working through the implementation phase of DBI, I'm not going to be able to go back and change the strength of the underlying tier 2 platform. This is just something that we use in the setup phase when we're rating and ranking the different intervention platforms against each other. The second dimension of the taxonomy is dosage. And it's easy to think of dosage in basic quantitative terms like the number of sessions that are provided or frequency, the number of minutes per session or the duration, and then the ratio of students to teachers. But dosage can actually be thought of more broadly as referring to the number of opportunities that a student has to respond and receive corrective feedback during the intervention's lessons. So in a math intervention, for example, the number of word problems that a student solves would be the number of opportunities that they have to respond. Okay, in a phonics intervention, it might be the number of words that they get to decode. Group size, frequency, and duration are factors that impact the number of opportunities that a student has to respond. But it's important to look more closely at each of the intervention platforms to determine how often would an individual student have the opportunity to practice and respond and receive feedback. Okay, the more opportunities that they have, the more intense that intervention platform is. During the DBI setup phase, you're going to try to decide what this average number of opportunities to respond is. In some cases, it's going to be really easy for you to see. You'll be able to look at the manual and they'll tell you right off the bat. But often you're probably going to need to look at a few sample lessons. And I suggest that you look at some lessons from the beginning of a program, some lessons from the middle, and some lessons from the end to try to give you a sense of how often are students going to be asked to respond, and will there be opportunities for the interventionist or the teacher or the tutor to provide support. During the implementation phase, you might decide to increase the intervention's intensity by increasing this dosage dimension, right? You might add additional sessions. You might make the sessions longer. You might reduce the group size so you can give more individual support. Or you might make more practice opportunities within the lesson so that the students have more opportunities to respond and receive feedback. The third dimension of the taxonomy is alignment. Alignment refers to the extent to which an intervention platform, number 1, addresses the student's full set of academic needs. Number 2, does not address skills the student has already mastered. And number 3, also incorporates a focus on grade level appropriate curricular standards. The more aligned the intervention is to the individual student you're thinking about, the more intense. Alignment is really important because many academic interventions address a restricted set of skills. For example, you might be choosing a math intervention, and the intervention that you find that seems to work well includes only calculation skills. But this student also has difficulties with word problems. So this intervention would not be perfectly aligned to the student's needs because it only addresses one of their deficits in the area of math. On the other hand, some interventions are very comprehensive and include a lot of skills that the student might have already mastered. So, for example, a literacy intervention might include things like phonics, decoding, sight words, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, writing, all these things, right? But maybe the student only has a comprehension deficit. So all that time that you spend in the intervention on phonics and decoding and fluency is actually making it less intense because it's less aligned to the student's skills. Also, remember, the whole point of the intervention that we're doing is to help students progress toward a level where they're able to receive benefit from Tier 1 instruction. So we want to get them as close as we can to their peers who are Tier 1, right? So the more that an intervention includes links to the grade appropriate curricular standards, the more aligned and the more intense this intervention will be. The fourth dimension of intervention intensity is attention to transfer. When I say transfer, I'm referring to generalization. An intense intervention is one that specifically considers the conduits by which the skills, strategies, and knowledge taught in the intervention are going to move into other contexts, okay? Transfer is a major, I repeat, it is a major obstacle for students with severe learning challenges. You may have noticed that one of the foundational concepts in the Holland justification statement on an IEP is that the students needs pull-out services because they're failing to use observational learning. In other words, they're not generalizing what they're learning to other contexts. So this is just a fundamental part of why we say a student is in need of more intensive intervention. I bring that up to reiterate that students in need of intensive intervention generally are those who have shown extreme difficulty with transfer. So interventions that recognize this and that provide direct and explicit instruction to help students transfer their skills to other contexts and other settings, those are going to be more intense. Interventions that do not address this, that just teach students about this skill but don't have any connection to context, those are going to be interventions that are less intense. When rating this dimension of the taxonomy, you're going to consider whether the intervention explicitly teaches students how to apply the skills taught in other contexts, and also if it helps them link the skills that are being taught to skills they've already mastered to help them see how they can apply what they're learning to solve new, novel, complex problems, okay? It's important to note, though, that just because an intervention scores low on this dimension in the setup phase, you might still choose this intervention for a student. So then in the implementation phase, you would know that this is just something that you might want to do to intensify the intervention down the road. So for example, if I'm implementing a decoding intervention, right, and in tutoring sessions, in my intervention sessions, I'm noticing that this student is really mastering these decoding skills that I'm teaching them. However, they're still not making progress on their progress monitoring data. So something is not transferring. They're not moving it to a new context. So I might add transfer instruction to help them see that they should apply this decoding skill that I'm teaching them in tutoring to other settings, like a progress monitoring, just for an example, okay? The fifth dimension of intervention taxonomy, intervention intensity, is comprehensiveness. When we say comprehensive, we're referring to the number of explicit instruction principles that are included in the intervention platform. Research indicates and has indicated over and over that students with severe and persistent learning challenges require explicit strategy instruction. The more explicit instructional principles found in an intervention platform, the more intense it is. The explicit principles include providing explanations in simple, direct language, modeling efficient strategies, ensuring that students have sufficient background knowledge and skills to succeed with those strategies, ensuring that students there's gradual fading of support provided for students to show and demonstrate correct execution of those strategies, and that the intervention provides sufficient amounts of practice. Another thing that makes it more comprehensive is the incorporation of systematic cumulative review. All of these different principles that comprise explicit instruction should be part of any intensive intervention. So when you're rating an intervention in the setup phase, you use this part of the taxonomy to see in a sample lesson, can you find all these different principles exemplified? You're going to note how many of them and how well these principles are included. And later in the implementation phase, you may decide to intensify by adding more of something. So maybe there's not enough practice when they're not making enough progress later on and we have to make an adjustment. Maybe one of the adjustments that we're going to make is to add additional practice opportunities. Or maybe we need to do more direct modeling of efficient strategy use. These might be areas that we can use to intensify the intervention down the road in the setup phase of DBI. The sixth dimension is behavioral support. Behavioral support is the extent to which the intervention incorporates different strategies to promote self-regulation executive function and to support reduce or minimize non-productive behavior within the intervention. When I say that it promotes self-regulation and executive functioning, this means that we are encouraging students with a history of academic failure to, one, persevere with challenging academic content, something that they struggle with, and an intense intervention would also support students to develop a mindset that involves perseverance, hard work, and high standards, okay? A intense intervention would incorporate more of that. It might focus on self-regulation. It might focus on different areas of executive function like attention or working memory to help students learn how to develop that mindset. You're going to want to examine an intervention protocol and determine the extent to which you see these different behavioral principles represented. Don't be surprised, however, when you do that, if you note when you're rating in the setup phase an intervention that the behavioral support provided is pretty minimal. A lot of times you're going to be looking at an intervention that was developed as an academic intervention, or maybe you're looking at just a behavior intervention, in which case it's designed to remediate that specific deficit, right? But in the real world, we know that our students usually have comorbid challenges, right? They're working against a lot of different factors. And so we may note that an intervention doesn't have enough behavioral support when we're rating it in the setup phase. So that might be something we modify right at the beginning to do it with another student. You know, maybe we're going to use what they have in their behavior plan or something like that right from the beginning. It's also something that we can adjust later on if the student isn't progressing. Maybe we need to do some things to help that student self-regulate or attend to task, or we need to do some things to help them learn to stay in their seat or to not do things that take away from instructional time. So we can intensify this dimension as we go to help individualize our intervention for students' needs. And the final dimension of the taxonomy is individualization. Individualization refers to the progress monitoring system that we're using. When we're selecting an intervention platform in the setup phase, you're not going to rate this particular dimension. Instead, you're going to note whether or not a validated progress monitoring tool is provided. And it's important to note that things like running records, informal checks for understanding, end-of-unit tests, while these are really great diagnostic tools, these are not validated measures for progress monitoring. Okay, they're not going to work to help us make the instructional decision of when and if we need to make an instructional adjustment and individualize that intervention. They're going to help us figure out how to make those changes, but they're not necessarily going to be the thing that helps us do it. If you visit the National Center on Intensive Intervention website and look at their tools chart, you can use that to help you compare progress monitoring instruments. And you can look at the individual psychometric data for each of the measures. You can look for the students for whom that measure has been used. You can look at details about how much time you can expect to use if implementing that, how much time it's going to take out of your instruction, the cost of purchasing any of those things, and descriptions of just how the measure works so that you can identify the best match for students you're working with. Sometimes, like I mentioned much earlier in this webinar, there's going to be a progress monitoring tool provided in the intervention, but very often that's not the case. So it's important that you really do think about this progress monitoring tool and what tool you're going to use, because it's going to be the foundation from which you're going to make your instructional decisions. So it's really important that it be aligned to students' needs, that it be validated, and that you know it's going to be sensitive to change, and it's going to tell you if the intervention you're using is working or not. So as we wrap up, I hope that this has been helpful to help you see how the taxonomy of intervention intensity can help you in both the setup phase and the implementation phase of the DVI cycle. In the setup phase, you can use the taxonomy to rate intervention platform's strength, its dosage, its alignment, its attention to transfer, its comprehensiveness, and its behavioral support. And you're going to use those ratings to compare, hopefully, more than one intervention platform to decide which one is going to be best for your students. The taxonomy can help you do that in a more systematic way. In the setup phase of the taxonomy, you're using the taxonomy in the DBI setup phase to help you identify the best match, and then you might also use it to help you make some initial adjustments prior to beginning the intervention. During the implementation phase, the taxonomy can be a useful tool to help you design an instructional adjustment to the intervention to intensify that intervention and meet the student's needs. I've gone through all of this pretty quickly today, and if you'd like to know more about the DBI process or about the taxonomy, I really encourage you to access some of these readings and read a little more. These are some helpful articles that can give you lots of additional information. The National Center on Intensive Intervention website is also a wonderful resource. On it, you can find additional webinars and presentations, reading resources, and those tools charts that I mentioned. One resource that you may find to be especially helpful is a recent webinar completed that shares a math case study. The webinar gives a real-world example of how the taxonomy can be used in practice in math. We'll provide a link to that archived webinar in the handout section. Moreover, if you are curious about how the taxonomy could be applied to other contexts, we'll be presenting a webinar highlighting a reading comprehension example on July 25th, and a behavioral case study webinar is also in production, so stay tuned. If you have any additional questions, I really encourage you to email NCII or visit intensiveintervention.org to learn more. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Best wishes as you implement database individualization, and I hope the taxonomy can be a useful tool as you meet the needs of your students. Thank you.